Okay, what if the primary purpose of a church isn't, spiritual worship?
That's a huge question to start with.
I know, it sounds almost, well, contradictory, doesn't it? Maybe even a little blasphemous, depending on where you grew up. But stay with me.
I'm with you.
What if the original blueprint wasn't about sermons or songs or even saving souls in the way we usually think about it? What if the church was designed to be a literal, hard-nosed economic community?
With a very pragmatic goal.
Exactly. To guarantee that its members simply eat and live.
It completely flips the script on what most people visualize when they think of church. But that is precisely the argument in the source material we're looking at today. And I mean, this isn't just some minor tweak to theology.
No, this is a fundamental reconstruction of what it means to be a believer.
It is.
And when we say source material, we're diving into a transcript from a lecture series called Biblical Humanities with Fellow Travelers.
Specifically, Lecture 102 from the YouTube channel Kenosis.
And it's a conversation between a questioner, Teacher Ginseng, and a pastor. And let me tell you, they do not pull any punches.
They certainly don't. They're moving from a long discussion on the Gospel of Luke and Acts into a, frankly, radical rereading of the Gospel of John.
And it's fascinating because they're not just doing a verse-by-verse commentary.
No, they're trying to dismantle the modern believer's entire self-image. They're arguing that we've domesticated the text, stripped it of its survival instincts.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The mission of this deep dive, then, seems to be convincing us that we've got it all wrong. The source argues we need to shift from being people seeking comfort,
which is what most of us do, consciously or not,
to realizing we are heirs responsible for managing the entire universe.
Yeah.
That is a massive leap. How do we get from, a church potluck to masters of the universe?
It's a huge leap. But to understand it, we have to start where they start, which is with the context of the early church. The source does a quick recap of their discussions on Luke and Acts to set the stage. And the headline there is that the first church, the one you read about in the book of Acts, was fundamentally an economic community. It wasn't a theology club.
And they use this specific term, the Jubilee spirit. Now, for anyone who hasn't brushed up on Leviticus lately, can we define that? It sounds like a party, but I have a feeling it's about money.
It is absolutely about money. The Jubilee, or the Year of Remission, was this ancient concept in Jewish law of sort of resetting the economic clock.
A hard reset.
A hard reset. Every 50 years, debts were canceled, slaves were freed, land went back to its original owners. It was a structural reset button to prevent permanent poverty.
So it levels the playing field.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the source argues that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus explicitly came to practice this Jubilee. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
In Luke, salvation isn't just some internal spiritual change. It's directly linked to practicing this economic sharing. You just can't separate the saving of the soul from the sharing of the wallet.
It mentions Zacchaeus, right, the tax collector. I remember that story from Sunday school. He climbs a tree, Jesus comes over. It's usually framed as a story about being eager to see Jesus.
Yes, but the climax of that story is the key. Zacchaeus is the prime example. He didn't just say, I believe in my heart.
Or I feel really good about you, Jesus.
Yeah. He said, I will pay back 4 times what I took and give half my possessions to the poor. That economic action, that redistribution of wealth, was the evidence of his salvation.
So the argument is that the church was originally a system to handle survival issues.
Precisely. The source defines the church's role as a system to secure and sustain the economic basis for its members to survive. I mean, in a world with no social security, no welfare, the church was the safety net.
Which just sounds completely alien compared to today. Usually church finances are about, we need to fix the roof, or we need to pay the staff, not we need to make sure everyone in this room has lunch today.
And that's the distinction the source makes. Modern churches often take money from members to run the institution itself. The early church system was designed to take resources from the institution to make sure the members didn't starve.
It was a survival mechanism.
It was literally the difference between life and death.
That is a heavy critique right out of the gate.
Yeah.
It basically says the cash flow is moving in the wrong direction today. But then they pivot to the Gospel of John, and the source makes this really unique claim.
Yeah, this part is fascinating.
They call the Gospel of John the Deuteronomy of the New Testament.
I loved this analogy. It really helps frame why John is so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It gives you a lens to understand the cone shift.
Okay, for those of us who aren't biblical scholars, break that down. Why Deuteronomy? What does an Old Testament law book have to do with the Gospel of John?
Well, Think about what Deuteronomy actually is. The name literally means second law.
Okay.
It was Moses reinterpreting the law for a new generation. The first generation, the ones who left Egypt, they had passed away in the wilderness.
They were gone.
Gone. Now their children are on the edge of the promised land. They didn't see the Red Sea part. They need the law explained to them, but for their new context. It's like an update patch.
The 2.0 version for the kids who missed the original events.
Exactly. And the source argues that the Gospel of John serves the same function. It was written much later than the other Gospels, maybe 60 years after Jesus.
So the first generation of Jewish believers was largely gone by then.
Right. Now you have a second generation, and many of them are Gentiles living in the Hellenistic, the Greek-speaking world. The context has completely changed. They aren't in Jerusalem anymore.
They needed a reinterpretation.
A reinterpretation for their specific time and place. John is rewriting the narrative to make sense to them.
And one of the biggest reinterpretations the source points out is about worship itself.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, the story of the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah.
Now, usually when we think of Holy Communion, the bread and wine, we think of the Last Supper, right?
That's the standard liturgy. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood," at that final meal.
But the source points out a massive structural shift in John.
A huge one. In the Gospel of John, that body and blood talk doesn't happen at the Last Supper at all. It happens during the feeding of the 5,000.
That seems like a very deliberate choice. Why move it? What does it change if you say, eat my flesh on a hillside instead of at a private dinner?
Well, the source argues that by placing that speech in the context of feeding thousands of hungry people, John is redefining what communion is.
He's saying it's not a symbolic ritual with a tiny wafer.
Exactly. He's saying it's actually about solving hunger.
Wow. So the body of Christ is lunch.
In a very practical sense, yes. The source explains that early Christian worship had two parts. Part 1, word study. Part 2, a joint meal. And for many people back then, that meal wasn't a snack.
No, it was likely the only decent meal they would get that day.
Right. We take food security for granted, but this was a caloric necessity. So those with means provided the food for those who didn't. The worship was the act of feeding the community.
The source really laments how that has devolved, right?
Yeah, that we've turned a survival mechanism into a tiny symbolic ritual. We kept the symbol but lost the substance. We eat a crumb of bread and think we've done the holy act, forgetting the original act was filling empty stomachs.
It makes you rethink the definition of service. If you go to a service and nobody gets fed, did you actually worship? That seems to be the challenge. But they go even deeper than that.
They do. They move from economics to a fundamental shift in identity.
Right. They zoom in on John 1.12.
To those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God.
We've all heard that verse. It's on bumper stickers. But the source says we read it wrong. We think child of God means like a warm, fuzzy feeling or just a title.
Like, I'm part of the family, so I'm saying...
Exactly. But
Yeah.
the source pushes back hard on that emotional interpretation. They focus on the word authority or right in that verse.
It's not a poetic description, it's a legal standing.
And they connect this to Romans 8.17
Yep.
to make a very bold, logical leap. If you are a child, you are an heir.
And an heir inherits what the parent owns. The logic the source uses is pretty striking. If God owns the universe and the believer is God's heir, then the believer...
Owns the universe.
Yes.
Okay, hold on. That feels huge. I mean, the source acknowledges how crazy that sounds. I don't walk around feeling like I own the universe. I barely own my car.
It feels arrogant, doesn't it?
It does. Like, who am I to say that?
And that is exactly where the source pushes for a revolution of self-consciousness. They admit we don't feel it, we feel small, but they use this great analogy of a child living in their parents' house.
Right.
Does the child say, "This is my mom's house, I'm just a guest here"? No. They say, "Let's go to my house."
Yeah, there's an inherent organic sense of ownership. If someone tries to break in, the kid doesn't say, "What's not my problem?" They defend it because it's theirs.
Exactly. The source argues believers have lost this. They see themselves as guests passing through. But the authority of a child is the authority of the heir. It means taking on the consciousness that this world is mine to look after.
So it's not ownership like I can exploit it. It's ownership in the sense of responsibility. If you own the house, you have to fix the leak.
Right. It's stewardship, but with the authority of an owner, not just a hired hand. An owner stays and fights for the property.
But we don't do that, do we? And this leads to probably the most biting critique in the lecture. The source talks about what they call shamanistic Christianity.
Yes, or Gibak religion, fortune-seeking religion. This is where they get very critical of the modern mindset. The argument is that most believers treat God like a cosmic vending machine for comfort.
They go to church to ask for peace or help with a problem. God, help me get this promotion. God, fix my back pain.
Which, on the surface sounds fine. That's often what prayer is taught as. But the source asks us to look at the maturity level of that dynamic. They use this analogy of a 40 or 50-year-old adult who still goes to their aging parents asking for an allowance.
Or, Mom, I had a bad day. Sing me a lullaby.
Exactly. The source says this behavior drives the parents crazy. It's deeply frustrating. A parent raises a child to become independent, to take over the family business. If the child is still begging for candy at age 50, something has gone terribly wrong.
That is a stinging indictment. It reframes seeking God for comfort as a sign of immaturity, not piety.
It connects right back to that heir concept. An heir isn't asking the CEO for pocket money. The heir is learning to run the company. A Christian's role, they argue, is not to receive, but to manage, to be the adult in the room.
So if we are the managers, what exactly are we managing? Because the source takes us in a direction I didn't expect, straight into ecology.
This is where the scope becomes cosmic. They cite Romans 8:19, the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed.
Creation waits. That's a strange phrase, like the trees and rocks are actually waiting for something.
The source interprets this very literally. Nature, the environment, the planet, it's suffering. They mention wildfires, floods, climate chaos. The argument is that creation is groaning under corruption. It's a system in distress.
And it's groaning because...
Because the owners are absent. The managers aren't managing. The source says nature is waiting for the believers to step up and restore order. If the contract between humans and nature is broken, it is the job of the heir to fix it.
That puts a completely different spin on environmentalism. It's not just about politics. It's about fulfilling your job description as the heir of the creator.
Precisely. It shifts the narrative from, God, please fix this storm, to, I am responsible for the climate because this planet is my inheritance. It's a move from passivity to active restoration.
And this all builds to the climax of the source's argument, which honestly I had to read twice. It's about saving God.
This is the most provocative point they make. It's a complete reversal. The entire premise of Christianity is usually that God saves humans.
Gospel 101, right?
But the source argues that a mature believer needs to save God.
You have to explain that. How does a human save God? That sounds, well, impossible. Why would God need saving?
Think back to that heartbroken parent analogy. The parent is watching their adult children fail to grow up. The parent is watching the family estate, the earth, fall into ruin while the kids just ask for snacks.
So God isn't angry. God is grieving.
Yes. The source describes God as being in agony over this. So how do you save a parent from that grief? How do you stop a parent's heart from breaking?
You grow up.
You grow up, you finally act like an adult, you take the keys, you say, I've got this, Dad. By taking responsibility for the world and our neighbors, we relieve God's agony. We save God from the pain of watching us fail.
That is incredibly powerful and also a little terrifying. It completely removes the safety net of, I'm just a helpless sinner, please help me.
It does. It demands a level of agency that most religious structures don't encourage. It suggests God is waiting for us. We are waiting for God to intervene, but maybe God is waiting for us to realize who we are.
It really brings us full circle. The economic community, feeding the hungry, environmental responsibility, it's all the same job.
It's all about acting like the owner of the house, not a guest. Whether it's ensuring your neighbor has lunch or the forest doesn't burn down, it's all management. It's exercising the authority of the child of God.
So we've gone from the early church ensuring survival to the Gospel of John redefining worship as feeding people, all the way to this cosmic responsibility to manage the earth and stop God's heartbreak.
It is a sweeping journey in one lecture. It ties economics, ecology, and theology into one very demanding package.
It really is. The source seems to be shouting at us to stop looking for a spiritual pacifier.
That's a great way to put it. The takeaway is a shift in the central question of faith. Moving from, God, what can you do for me, to, I am the heir responsible for this place. What needs to be done?
It changes everything. It changes how you view your wallet, your Sunday morning, even the news about the climate. It's not just news, it's a damage report on your property.
It is. I mean, if you think about it, what if that was the dominant view of the church today? Not an institution for moral support, but a global network of heirs who feel personally responsible for the survival of their neighbors and the planet.
That would be a force to be reckoned with. And it brings up a final provocative thought for everyone listening. The source suggests that if we don't realize this identity, if we stay in that child asking for an allowance phase, we are just failing ourselves.
We are actively causing God pain.
It raises the question, are we the adult children who have finally taken over the family business? Or are we still sitting on the couch, 40 years old, asking our parents for a glass of water?
That's the question to sit with.
It is. Well, that is a question that might keep me up tonight. Thank you for walking us through this incredibly deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating perspective.
And to our listener, thanks for being with us. We will see you on the next deep dive. Take care.